and welcome to another video on the Philosophical Weightlifting YouTube channel. I am your host, Joshua Gibson, and I'm joined today by the lovely, and for some reason, you look extra handsome today. I don't quite know what it is. I think it might be the backdrop.
Probably.
For people who haven't seen the inside of Max's house, this is his living room, so you can live vicariously through our video and imagine yourself there. The thing we wanted to do is bridge the two videos Max did when he was in Columbus for the Arnold's, which were training related. We looked at the concepts of specificity and then overload, and those videos are like 30 minutes each. They're great in depth. They cover a lot of like theoretical work and allow you to start to visualize what it looks like to build out a program. Before we get into how Max has, again, kind of created some continuity with those videos, Max, how has your day been?
It's been pretty good. Yeah, been just working Saturday. Was it say Saturday, Sunday? Sunday is always a work day. So
yeah, I messaged you and I said, Max, when do you work? You said, I always work.
Yeah, I'm pretty much always doing something, whether it's productive or not, we'll see. But so some kind of work.
Yeah, I think one thing that could be cool. We talked about this a little bit before we started recording, but ultimately, I think people have a good grasp on the amount that you do, the amount of work you do, the amount of people you coach, the involvement in the app, the educational content you put out, like all these things you've been able to do over the years and continue to do. And maybe you can kind of explain to everyone listening why exactly you're so damn productive.
I have to be. I don't know. I mean, a lot of it is like I see a lot of things I want to do, and so like I don't think that's a good thing. I think spreading myself out and like spreading myself on too many fronts is definitely not advisable. But the big thing is like I want to try to establish, I think the big picture, like we were talking about earlier, is like I want to establish something that creates a continuity through weightlifting, and a lot of that is like trying to get good information out that is consistent across the board, that you're saying the same things, that there's a consistent like message and a consistent common glossary between terminologies and things you're talking about, training concepts and this and that. So nothing is proprietary sound, nothing is fabricated. But I think there's a lot of too, like from my side, like picking a lot of projects because I feel like there's a lot of areas that are potentially beneficial to be involved in, right? Like building the app, I think, is one of those examples where it's like something like that doesn't exist, and there's a huge amount of people to reach with something like that can get people started off on the right foot with training that is reasonable, that is you can get an example of what a good individualized program is, and something that is manageable and kind of creates a universal platform for people to build off of. And then on top of that, educational content and stuff, and potentially building like, more of a certification project later. Like that's the kind of thing that I think would be beneficial too, because you can bring a lot of people in to work on the project and get a varied experience and get a lot of people in there, but having the lens of understanding that everyone can look through the same lens and hear the same terms and hear the same, sort of language being used across the board will help everybody get better at doing this kind of stuff, right? So that's one reason to be involved in a lot of stuff and kind of have like my fingers in too many pies, trying to do too many things. But then on top of that, like, it's also just a matter of like, it's fun. I mean, doing stuff is fun. It's fun to make stuff and try to create things. And so I enjoy that.
Yeah. And I think you've done a good job of it. And for people who are watching this and want to check out the app, I think it's like open to pretty much everyone now if people want to sign up, right?
I think so. I think this week we'll open it up to everybody. I think it's a wide release. I think it might be on the App Store currently as this video comes out. I don't think it's announced on the App Store, but it's there. You can find it and download it, I believe.
Yeah, and I feel like it's been getting really good feedback, and just being in the performance community, it seems like definitely, as you mentioned, something that is really unique and doesn't exist outside of this specific weightlifting
Mhm.
AI. I mean, all the template stuff in the Train Heroic and all those things, like, yeah, you can talk to people, but I think there's more depth here than anything else.
Yeah, the big thing to me, like it's funny because like the AI component, the fact that the system is intelligent is one thing. The reality is like the biggest the biggest value that the app provides is a centralized
Mm,
place where my coaching logic, my understanding, which grows, weekly, daily as I talk to people, as I do stuff, like that will continually make its way into the product, right? So it's like the it sounds weird when I say it, but whatever version you just got is the worst
right.
version there is, right? It sounds negative. It's like it's also the best version, but it's like the goal is that you have something that can continually get better and better, not necessarily for any one individual. Like that happens, the system adapts to you, but it's that it gets better and better because better logic, better
Mm,
ideas, hey, new information comes out. So a good example is like the exercise selection process, the exercise list. And you kind of caught the tail end of a mentorship meeting we had earlier, but like, we've got like let's say you have a spreadsheet. Let's say theoretically that spreadsheet has, 2,000 exercises on it for snatch. And that sounds like a big number, but that's a lot of like, variations in different
right.
rep schemes, right? Let's say you got like 100 different exercises. And how do you pare those down to being like, what are the best 5 exercises for
Mm,
somebody who has a problem with their first pull, right? Well, we could all probably think of 5 things off the top of our head. And then you'd have to ask yourself, well, what's the difference between like a pause snatch at the knee and a pull to this, pull to the knee plus a snatch and like
mm,
a deficit snatch? And like all 3 of those might all be, on the 30,000 foot view might all be the same. They are going to all work the first pull, but maybe there's a better place to put one or the other based on other factors, right? Maybe if the person has weak legs or strong legs, or they do something kind of strange, their hips come up or their hips don't come up or whatever it is. How can we refine that list? And it's always going to be a matter of probability, right? We're never going to get this is the best. I fucking hate when people say the top 5 exercises, top 3 exercises, right? It's like, well, there's no context, right? The top 5 for somebody who has, all 4 limbs. What if they're missing an arm, right? Like, so it's like it's just like ridiculous on that level. So I feel like what I want to get to is, what I know the app will get to is that we'll continually have this learning that makes its way into the app that'll be like, hey, so we can continually refine something like a list like that.
mm,
So here's 5 exercises for the first pull. Let's filter them by 2 or 3 more variables that we know, right? Okay, strong legs or weak legs. Okay, we can get a better filter. We know that, hey, this deficit works a little better with people who have short legs
mm,
and strong squats because it increases the length of their pull. And so that makes its way into the system. And so now you have a filter that's like, well, somebody's bad at the first pull, and we know their squat strength, and we know this variable. And so it's like the more filters you can get, the more refined the process gets, the better and more accurately you can predict and give people things that have a high probability of succeeding. It's always going to be a probability game because you're never going to have the for sure this is the best. But if we get more and more accurate with something like that, and that's not even like a problem that has to be solved with anything advanced, right? That's a problem of numbers. It's a problem of experience. And it's a problem of like, we take a foundation and we look at it and we say, okay, what decisions that we made early in building this are wrong now that we think should be different. And so that's that's like what excites me about it is like the ability to continually have this like repository of like learning of like, we're just going to keep refining and refining and making changes and adding as I learn, as we learn, as more people give us better information, on top of the fact that the system itself will be doing that on an individual basis with people. And eventually the goal would be like, when we have enough users to spit out information to us and say, hey,
right.
here's the data that shows like people swapped from this exercise to that exercise, and they generally did better this way, or these kinds of training sessions were we can draw conclusions from it. That's kind of cool. So like I think about like it's cool now, but like in 2 years, what will it be? What will we learn? The irony will be that it'll just be the Bulgarian system. The system will just like, oh yeah, just max out every day. That's it. There it is.
Right.
It'll like bring ads up for like Diana Ball on people's like computers.
Yeah. Well, I think that is actually a really good point. And I haven't quite thought of it in this way, but a lot of the reason why people say the research that came from the Soviet Union is so effective is that it has such a large sample of weightlifters, and that was tightly controlled. And you could carry that logic out and say, okay, well, if you get 5,000 to 10,000 users on the weightlifting AI, and you carry their training out over years and years and years, you could then use that to effectively figure out, like, for this large sample of people, what makes sense for the people with these qualities, what makes sense for people. And like you said, you could start to peel away the individual differences and find what works. And then you can start to layer on the individual differences and find what works. So it just gives you like a more well-rounded picture of how to coach weightlifters to a high level.
And a lot of like A/B testing, right? That's something that that just can't be done. I mean, it can't be done at the scale that a coach is going to do it. Like for one, you're getting paid, a small amount of money to be a weightlifting coach. And so like at some point you just like, I want to go home and like, like it's just very few people are going to do that. And the sample size would be very small, but we have the ability to do that kind of stuff, which is like, to me, it's just like awesome. If we get to that scale, if we get to that point, like to be able to make it something that's, that's like a very cool sort of information gathering device. One thing too about it that I really want to ensure, I know Seb is very much in line with this, is like I don't like the idea of creating something that's like a adversarial thing to everybody.
Right.
Like having something that's like this huge thing, but like everyone's like, okay, this is like the evil empire or whatever. Or like, okay, you got this product and that's it, and like you're either in it or you're out. I would rather see it become something that's universal. Like I would rather see people adopt stuff in the app and use it to make things and use it to create their own logic. Like I have a guy I used to coach that he uses like the rating system, the white and red lights. He does it with a spreadsheet, and he just has a person like, explain it to them. But like to me, that's the kind of thing that's beneficial to everybody. It's like RPE, right? RPE is something that like, if it was proprietary and someone just made it, like Mike Tushir was like, no, it's mine. Like everyone's got to stop doing this. Like think of the value loss there. So I see it as like, I'd rather be not adversarial with people, but like be sort of a universal, like, oh yeah, okay, this is like a very basic, like this is a fundamental now that exists in training. Which would be cool, to get to that point. And we'll see if that happens, but yeah.
When I think you going through the logic of it and even showing us, some of the spreadsheets that help with the decision making within the app, it just shows how much there is to think about and to know about programming in for weightlifting or in weightlifting. So it's really opened my eyes into the amount of detail that you can create or that can exist if you put enough work in, or if you have the right resources to kind of figure it out. Because you had just line after line after line after line of decision making with like strong squat, weak squat, balanced, and then what that means with exercise selection, and then what that means with like the rep set sequence.
Right.
Very complicated, but I'm sure very simple in the same breath.
Yeah. It's like tedious. There's a lot of little decisions. And the thing that's funny to me is like, people make choices as coaches that are instantaneous. And when you break it down, like how you got to that conclusion is amazing. Like the number of decisions you had to make and know and experience you had to learn to get there, just from watching someone do something, is pretty impressive. And it really actually shows, what it really shows to me is the value of an experienced coach. A lot of people think that like the value of an experienced coach is really, I think, underestimated by a lot of people. If you have somebody who's been doing this sport for a long time and watched a ton of lifting, they are the skill that person develops is very valuable and unique. It kind of reminds me of something in baseball. There was this belief that like people that could hit fastballs had superior like hand-eye coordination and reaction time. And what they found was that like generally wasn't the case, that they had superior hand-eye coordination than anyone else in the, other peers. What they found, what they believed they found, was that it was their ability to identify by looking at the pitcher what was happening, because they had seen so many pitches that they could identify like the timing of when to start swinging, right? So they'd see the person, wind up and start to unwind and start to throw the ball, and they could identify exactly when during that moment they should start swinging to time hitting the ball properly, which to me is like really cool, because it's like, well, as coaches and experienced coaches, like how much of that process that we learn when you watch somebody do a lift, within the first couple seconds, you know, like instantly what's right or wrong with the lift, right? You don't need to watch 12 videos to tell. You can tell right away, right? You see one video and know exactly, you can identify a bunch of things about somebody from one video they're lifting, which is really cool. And like, that's the kind of thing that I think is an interesting thing. When you go through that process of building this out, like you realize like, oh shit, like the experienced coaches are very valuable. There's a lot they learn and a lot they do in a very short period of time that seems effortless, but requires a ton of decision making.
Right. Yeah. And I think there's no better introduction to what we wanted to talk about, which is like how to effectively create programs that can give you effectively what programming does is it provides you with this process to create a result, and then you figure out successful or unsuccessful, and then you recreate the process or mess with it or don't, and then you get a different or the same results, and then you do that, like you said, enough times you can start to recognize what works and what doesn't, start to recognize patterns, and then you can start to overlay kind of that quicker decision making. So we're getting into the nuts and bolts of how to do this for people who aren't using this process, which I found actually really useful, at least thinking about it in this way. So maybe you can pull up what you've written up. Yeah.
So
yeah. Yeah. What? Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. What? Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
We'll go through a very basic, we're just going to build like a single week of training. I'm going to show you some stuff. This kind of summarizes a lot of what we did last time, but also maybe makes it a lot more clear. So just for snatch exercises, because it's all the same essentially for every primary movement, right? Snatch, clean, jerk, pull, squat. The first thing we want to do is be able to define what type of sessions we're going to do. So in my definition of a session would be like one lift and exercise, like power snatch, and then the intensity attached to that and the amount of volume attached to that. And so this is like our definition of essentially like a little Prilipin's table, Prilipin's style table of total volume per session based on what the session's focus is. And the obvious thing here is that, work capacity, general strength, specific strength, competition practice are, just associated with an intensity. In Prilipin's table, there's a set size associated with each of these. I didn't put that here because that could vary depending on a multitude of things, but it's not super necessary for us to know that right now. What we want to know though is, what are our sessions, right? What kind of sessions do we have? What is the minimum effective volume of that session in one day? And what's the maximum we would have an athlete perform in one day as far as total reps? And the reason we want these boundaries is that this determines whether or not that session is in fact stimulative enough to drive progress, or if it's the limit of like the target for where we should shoot for on any one session, right? You could look at this and say, okay, you've got 60 to 70% for work capacity, which is really low intensity. 12 reps is your maintenance range, right? So like below 12 reps is probably not very effective at doing much of anything. Above 12 reps, you probably are getting close to like starting to be effective volume. There's always a gap between maintenance and minimum, as far as like, the minimum would be defined as like the minimum you need to be an effective training session. There's always a gap there because, one set is probably not the reality. Like, 4 reps might not be the reality, but we want to be in a range that we know is acceptably below the minimum amount of training to just barely make progress or barely hold on to what we have. And these numbers are always going to be difficult to discover and prove, right? We don't know this for sure. These are essentially estimates. Everything is an estimate because we don't really know exactly what's going on inside the body, but these are our best estimates of this. Minimum volume is essentially, how much is somebody going to need to do in one session to make it productive enough to be doing, right? Are they going to drive progress? Is this an actual overloading session or not? And then maximum is the limit on what we would have in one session, right? And these are for snatch. This is just, I just picked some numbers here based on somebody's abilities. These could be anything, but this would be individualized to a person. So if you're somebody who's, a little bit smaller, a little bit lighter, not as strong, these numbers would move up, right? The minimum might move down, the maximum might move up. If you're somebody who's really, really strong and, very, very advanced in their career, the minimum might move up really high and the maximum might move up a little bit more. So you might have these numbers being very close to each other, right? So 16 to 24 might actually be like, 20 to 24, right? If you're really advanced. If you're a beginner, this might be as low as, basically essentially 0 if you're a beginner, but like, it could be very low, like 10 or something. And so what this does is it gives us parameters to build a training session, right? If a training session is focused solely on one quality, and in general, our sessions are focused on one quality. We're generally not going to do, we're not going to try to do an entire amount of a whole work capacity session and a specific strength session in the same day for snatch. That would just be an enormous training session and most likely not productive. So this gives us the essential, like, here's our parameters, here's what we're building. Then we would say in our week, we would decide, okay, what are the number of overload sessions per microcycle per week? So this again is the number of these sessions that occur, the number of any number of these minimum size sessions that occur in a week. And that's really based on, an individual's ability to tolerate training, right? How heavy they are, how strong they are. Someone who is, also what phase they're in. I didn't actually name this, but this week we're building is just going to be a strength phase. It's like middle of the road, like, probably 6 weeks out or 12 weeks out or 12, let's say 6 to 8 weeks out from a competition or something. So general strength in nature. This would be something that we'd look at and say, okay, if you're somebody who's snatching 105 kilos and you're a 110 kilo lifter, like, you can probably handle several overload sessions a week, right? Let's say 3 is probably in the snatch, probably not out of question. If you're somebody who's extremely strong, right, you might not have very many overload sessions. You might have one major overload session that's significantly hard enough to drive volume, because for one, this number might come up a lot. So your minimum volume might come up a lot, which makes the session bigger. And the amount of weight you're lifting is significant. So it's like, snatching 180, for 15 reps in a workout is quite significant, right? And so you might only have one overload session in a week.
Mm.
Generally speaking, most people are probably somewhere between, 2 and 4, right? To be very, very strong, to be outside of 2, to be lower than 2. It's also phase dependent. If you're in a hypertrophy phase, we know that our work capacity here is significantly easier to recover from. So the number of overload sessions, the frequency can be much higher. So you could potentially have 3 or 4 work capacity overload sessions in a week and have no issue, right? It's a lot of volume, but it's not going to kill you, right? Doing a bunch of complexes between 60 and 70% in the snatch or the clean really isn't like, no one's dying from that, right? They'll complain to no end and talk about why are they doing CrossFit, but the reality is like, yeah, that's not super hard. Whereas if you're doing, if you're in like a peaking phase and you have a significant number of these 2 types of sessions, right? Specific strength and competition practice, you have much less volume, but those workouts are much more challenging to recover from.
Right.
So you might only have 2 overload sessions, one of each, where you have like a max out on Friday in this 90 to 100% range, and then you have some specific strength between 80 and 90% sessions the rest of the week, or one other in the rest of the week. Conversely, you could even have in peaking, you could have 1 overload session, which is just this maximum session at the end of the week. And then you can have the other sessions, 3 or 4 other sessions in the week for snatch could all be maintenance sessions in this lower range, which is much smaller, right? 8 singles or something, or whatever it is. Or 4 doubles or something at 80% to 85%, where it's like, those are very manageable, small maintenance type sessions. You might even have maintenance sessions in the general strength range too, right? So understand that this number of overload sessions is kind of a guide to saying, really the easiest way to think about this is like, how many hard sessions am I going to have a week versus how many sessions I'm going to have that are designed to be easier in total volume, where I'm going to gain some kind of ability to recover during that day, or it's easy for the sake of having a harder session of a different exercise, right? So you could have like really hard snatching on Monday coupled with maintenance sessions of clean and jerk the same day, right? So that's essentially what we have for our loading parameters. Okay, how are we actually chopping up a workout? How do we build an actual workout? The second thing we want to know before we actually build the week is, this is like the most ridiculous amount of information, basically 0 to help you guys, but it really comes down to like, I have dozens of spreadsheets with thousands of lists of exercises on them, and this is what I spit out for you guys. But it's really basically saying, okay, what are our sessions in the week? This is a 4-day a week program, right? We've got 4 sessions. We're going to say how many sessions are focused at each thing. The number 1 weakness, the number 2 weakness, and the number 3 would be classic. We're always going to have some amount of classic snatch or clean and jerk in the program throughout the year, unless you're in like a recovery phase or a total off season, like you're just doing like CrossFit, something where it's like specifically you're getting away from the lifting. If you have a traditional meet prep style training, you have to have some kind of classic exercise comprising this. In this case, it's 25% of the total sessions in the week, right? And it could be higher, it could be lower, depending on the phase. In this example, I just did this to show you if somebody has 2 weaknesses, more than likely they would probably have 2 classic snatch sessions and then 2 sessions that were focused on their weaknesses. But this basically gives us the ability to say, okay, how much are we distributing the volume to specific exercises versus things that are non-specific, but like weakness focused. The second column here is basically saying, what are the focuses of that session? So what is the actual positional component phase of the lift we're working on? Well, our biggest weakness for this person is their transition, right? What they do with the bar as it passes their knee. What they do with their body as the bar passes their knee. And then the second thing, which is less weak, less bad, but we identify that, we call it the finish, right? The final extension. What happens at the top of the lift, right? So this person maybe is like pretty good from the floor, maybe not so great at the top. Maybe they cut their pull a little bit, or maybe the bar goes around their knees, and so they push their hips out to the bar and kind of lose the finish. I just kind of made this up, but it's pretty common, right? So we'd say, okay, we really want to fix that problem around their knee, so we're going to give them 2 sessions devoted to their number 1 weakness. The finish is bad, but it's not as bad, so we're going to give 1 session there, not as much focus on that. And then classic exercise, we're going to get one focus. Now, we also know that, hey, we have to have some, because we're getting close to competition, because it's a strength block. The classic exercise is going to occupy an overload spot. So we'd come down here and we'd look and say, okay, we've got 4 sessions. We want to say, what are our overload sessions versus what are our maintenance sessions? So we'd say, okay, session 1 is overload, and it's going to be focused on weakness number 1. And the strength, the session type is going to be general strength. So we know the percentage and we know the total number of lifts. And then I made this column here as set size, which is basically like, we're going to decide based on the exercise, based on that person, what set size they should get, right? We're going to give them triples here in this case. This is probably the biggest column for understanding your athlete and knowing exactly what to give them. Some exercises, you know, if you have a complex that requires 3 elements, it's going to have to be 3 reps. Right. If you've got something that's like, you know, if you're adding pauses in, then the set size has to come down a little bit, right, to accommodate for that. If somebody's really tall, they might have less set size. They might have the same volume, but they have lower, you know, smaller sets. Somebody's really short might have the opposite. So this is something that becomes very individualized as to exactly what you want to achieve with your lifter in picking the right set size, because you're also picking exercises as well as this. Second thing we look at, the next overload session, right? Their second overload session, it actually should be 2. I made that 3 just for sake. Second overload session here, we know is going to be a classic exercise, right? Because we don't want to have them only maintaining the snatch skill right now. It's not, we're getting close enough that we have to start training the snatch a little bit more. It's going to be a specific strength session versus general strength, because we know we're getting close to competition. We also know that we can reduce volume overall if we have a little bit heavier session here for the classic snatch, whereas we're not trying to develop it as much. We're trying to develop this weakness first. So we would start higher on the intensity bracket, right? We don't need to be at this low intensity right now. This is something that's not being, it's closer to maintenance, but it's just less volume is going into that. It's not entirely a maintenance session, but we want to move towards more specific practice with this. And so it gets this volume, and then it's chopped up into doubles. Then the next 2 sessions, just to give an example here, are maintenance sessions. So we have another session for weakness number 1, because we wanted a couple of sessions here focused on it. So we're going to increase the total volume that actually gets allocated to the transition, because it's the weakest thing. And we want to focus on the same intensity range, because that's where we're at. We're in our training phase, but we're going to have less volume devoted to it and smaller set sizes. And then finally, session 4, we have a maintenance for weakness number 2, right? The finish. And because the finish is maybe, you know, not as big of a deal, but we want some specific targeted practice at it, we're going to be doing some kind of work capacity work to maintain it. But basically, it doesn't need to be focused entirely on development there. It's just basically skill retention, right? So this table basically gives us a chance to look at what is our actual structure of the week going to look like, from what we're building here, what we've got, you know, essentially picked out for each one of these exercises that we're going to do, or each one of these sessions we're going to do. The next thing we would do is sort of put it together into a program. And let me bring up another example. And this is just something I made. Is that sharing?
Not yet.
No. Stop that share.
Yeah, and just to comment on that quickly,
Oh yeah, sorry.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, like, we've done, I don't know how many podcasts and had so many conversations, and to actually be able to visualize it like this is really made sense of what you've said, because you talk about, you know, you don't think about the exercises first necessarily, or you know, the program itself. It starts with the numbers and then kind of works down. And I always thought, like, what would that look like in practice? I'm like, well, that makes complete sense, especially with a chart similar to something like that.
Sure. And it's like, this is very rudimentary. I've been
right.
I've been doing a lot of other stuff the last few months, but yeah. So can you see this new table? Okay. So this is just like a sample of, like, here's a 4 time a week program. And I highlighted just the snatching to show you a good example of some of this stuff. So we look at our first session. We know it's weakness number 1. We know it's an overload session. We know it's general strength. And so it gives us a breakdown of this, right? This is, let's say, week number 1. So we're going to start at 70% as our intensity for triples. Now, because a lot of what I've done over the last years has been focused on the AI, the AI has auto regulation built in. So this starts at 70, but potentially could scale to, I mean, you could add, 2-3 kilos each set here, 2 or 3% each set, and end up at a totally different number at the end. So it's really just a starting point, right? So it looks like that's a very easy workout, but it really potentially could be very heavy by the end, right? These numbers could jump up. The goal is just have a start point. I also have warm-ups and stuff written in here, but that's not really relevant. These warm-ups are essentially not necessary to calculate. We're only concerned with like work sets when we calculate our session types. You could potentially have a session that's like, 4 triples at 60, 4 triples at 70,
right.
4 triples at 80. And that, it's not to say that session doesn't, what does that session work? Well, you'd have to look at the entirety of it. If it's a huge volume of work, primarily it's probably developing work capacity more than anything else. Sessions that are gigantic are not developing, they're generally not developing a ton of power or strength, right? It doesn't mean that they can't. You could have a session that's potentially, singles between 70 and 90%. And again, like mostly what you're doing there is essentially, blending is the wrong word because every session is essentially training multiple qualities. You have to just define, hey, what is this session most likely accomplishing, right? If you've got 42 reps and it ranges from, triples to singles from 60 to 90%, it's a, you'd have to sort of break that down. What am I actually doing here? What is this session geared at?
Right.
When I train with Goff, we would have like snatch sessions that would last like 3 hours, and we'd snatch singles all day. What are you really training there? What
right.
quality you're training? You're training mental toughness. That's what that session does.
Right.
But it trains, potentially you're training endurance more than you think. You're training some kind of work capacity and endurance more than you're training else.
Right.
Power training kind of sessions are not giant volume sessions. So just to make that known, right? These are the base intensities. So then we would say, okay, we've got these 2 overload sessions here. Second one on Wednesday, we organize this into the classic exercise session, and then we have 2 of our non-overload sessions at the end of the week. And we discussed in the other videos how you come to this weekly organization based on a priority list, right? So we have like session number 1, session number 1. Well, that should be general. Down through session number 4, and we would organize this by like, hey, what are the ones, what do we want to accomplish here? This is our hardest, this is our second hardest, this is our third,
right.
and this is our 4th, right? And so it might not be the order that it's listed here. It might reorganize itself based on where you want them to occur in the week.
Right.
And we talked about that in the video, but a lot of that is based on the SRA curve of different things, right? So, think about the process by which you organize a week along that curve, and consider things like what happened the day before this session and what's happening the day after this session.
Right.
So, a lot of that is just rule-based. If you were to stop and say, okay, Monday, right? What happens on Monday? Well, it's always after an off day. So this session could be, the first overload session, the most significant overload, which is the weakness number 1, because it's the thing we want to train the most, right? So it's going to start the week off. This is our biggest, most important session. We start it the day after a rest day. But then what comes after that? Well, in this case, it's a 4-day week, so there's a rest day as well. So then we have another off day before Wednesday. This could be another overload session, right? And then by the fact that we only have 4 days in this week, we quickly realize that these next 2 sessions can essentially be, maintenance sessions that are easy.
Right.
In this case, Friday, Saturday, we would say Friday comes after an off day. So a harder session is likely to start there. and Saturday comes after a rest day, or sorry, after a training session. So it can be an easier session, or should be an easier session, right? And a lot of this is rule-based, is all rule-based. And what you would want to do is sit down with your week and say, okay, how many overload sessions do I have? How many maintenance sessions do I have? What are the best organizations for that? What I would recommend you do if you're going to program is come up with templates, right? You're going to have a few templates that make sense. You know, there's not 1,000 combinations for distributing, you know, 5 workouts into 5 days.
Right.
There's a few that make sense, and there's a few that are significantly better or significantly worse, right? Having all of your overload sessions Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then maintenance sessions the rest of the week through the weekend, not as good as spreading those out, right?
Right.
But again, like we talked in that video, it's a lot of this is about basically constructing the most, like, what's the most beneficial and rule-based way for me to do this, so that I understand what makes sense from the rules. I could look at this and I could change it on a whim and say, actually, I think it's better to have the classic thing on Monday.
Right.
For whatever reason. The problem with that for me has always been, how is that defined? Why am I doing that? And if I can't answer that question, if I can't answer the question why I'm doing it,
Right.
then the question is, should it be done?
Right.
You know, and if you answer the question with a simple answer, like, well, we should do classic snatch first because, you know, X, Y, and Z, because, you know, on Sunday he watches a ton of Ilya Ilin videos and he's psyched up and ready to do it. He doesn't want to do hang snatch on Monday. Then, okay, so you got to start listing that stuff. And so for me, a lot of it is like creating a process as to why these things are assigned a certain day. A rule-based system makes sense. Look at what happened the day before, look at what's going to happen the next day, and make a judgment about how that's going to affect the SRA curve, like what happens in that. If this day was a giant snatch day with 12 sets or something huge, and then, you know, this was Tuesday instead of Wednesday, definitely not ideal to have your classic snatch specific strength session there.
Right.
That should be moved to a different day, right? This could be Monday is a huge session overload, and then Friday is a huge overload session, right? And this week only has 2 overloads, so it's really an easy week. This would be like the very first week of the strength block. He might only have, you know, the next week he might have a 3rd overload session. You might say, look, we start slowly and we start with 2 overload sessions to get him into the program, and then we add a 3rd, and he stays at 3 until, you know, the last week, and then we deload. So, you know, there's a lot of little nuances there as far as, like, I probably just glossed over, but yeah, it's something to think about. It's important, but, you know, create a rule-based system to do it.
Yeah, I think one thing I kind of picked out just looking at this is the way you have organized the exercises. So maybe you can talk about how the priority of the exercise in terms of like weakness, classics, overload, maintenance would fit into then structuring a training day.
Yeah, for sure. So like if we look at like this first day, right? And I only did that, I started doing this in the cleans, but I realized I didn't want to have to build the whole program. But we have here is we say, okay, this person's going to start, you know, we would start with based on the number of overloads. So let's say in this case, let's change this and say this is a maintenance session, right? Let's say we could build a program if we're building something that's a little farther from a competition or someone who needs a little more recovery. We would start with snatch, generally first, right? Clean and jerk second, pulls third, squats after that, and then any accessory like a pressing or overhead exercise that's necessary to do. So in this case, like let's say, you know, we have the overload snatch, our what we call the hardest session, right? They have the biggest volume here. It's the most overload session of the week. In clean and jerk, obviously I changed this so these numbers are not indicative, but you know, in this session would be a maintenance session for clean, right? So it might be session number 4 or 3 or something for the clean, right? If the clean and jerk had the same 2 overloads. And what that does is it allows us to make every day of the week, if we were to structure things this way, every day of the week can be relatively similar in difficulty, right? So we've distributed stressors to make each day of the week relatively similar because we're training, you know, in a way that, you know, we're far enough from competition that we don't need significant recovery day to day. You'd have
Right.
plenty of time to recover day to day because you have an off day twice a week here, 3 times a week. So this would allow us to say, okay, our Monday, main overload session is followed by a maintenance session for the classic classic clean, right, afterward. And then we would do our pulls, our squats, and our jerks. And so you basically create this sort of undulation in difficulty between the different exercises. So snatches are hard, cleans are easy, and then let's say you pair squats and snatches together. And the intensity here on squats is all based off of clean and jerk. You don't have to you can disregard that, it doesn't really matter. But it's essentially just make this easier to have 2 numbers when I made this for somebody. So think about it from the perspective of what are we trying to accomplish in any one day, and then how do we best distribute the stress in this particular phase? How do we best distribute the stress to something that is more spread out so they can manage fatigue well, because they have plenty of recovery time. They have plenty of off days in the week. They have ample way to recover. If somebody had 4 overload sessions and they trained 4 days a week, there's no options. You just have to, but that in that situation, it just is the case, right? Generally, what I found is that the frequency that somebody trains at is one of the largest determining factors for how they train. And it's almost the number one, self-selected feature of a program. Right. Which is kind of funny. If people wrote programs that were optimal, the most optimal program you could possibly write, the frequency would be something you'd manipulate a little bit more. And perhaps you would have somebody train every other day, right? And in which case they would do like Sunday, they do like Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, right? And it's like I don't know anybody that trains like that. I've never met a person who trains like that. We all train, Monday, Wednesday, Friday for sure, like the big days, and then Tuesday, maybe Thursday, Saturday are the smaller days. And it's funny because the optionality of being able to make adjustments to a program that way based on changing the frequencies and stuff is pretty vast, but it's something we never do. So so what we do is in this type of phase, we would have, okay, here's our first week, here's our first exercise, snatch. This one we've made a maintenance session instead. So it's going to be lower volume, easier to deal with. Pulls always follow the lifts simply from a standpoint of practicality. The bar's already on the ground usually, so it's just a lot easier to do that. You can certainly write pulls in after your squats, and I think that seems to be more of a cultural thing. Some people do squats before pulls, but it seems like most of the time pulls are more practically included afterward. And then your squats, your strength exercises at the end of the workout, and then any kind of overhead or accessory stuff that's going to happen after that.
I was talking to someone yesterday, and it kind of sparked a thought about how other coaches will program in squats. So I know maybe some coaches think further away from a meet, the squat should be the first exercise in a training session. And that generally might not change until they're more in like a specific prep or like comp prep block. Do you have any thoughts on keeping squats like more of a priority or less? Have you noticed a difference practically with them in different spots?
Yeah, so I would say, there's a lot of ways to organize that. One of the things with squats that I think becomes a crutch, not crutch. I think one of the issues with the squat is that, people try to drive the results of the lift entirely with squats. And so a huge amount of focus comes from squatting, like how do we maximize the squat? And, something like programming squats before the lifts would make sense if a huge amount of squat strength increase had such a dramatic impact on the lifts that forgoing the benefit of technique work being done on the lifts when you're fresh, was, okay, you'd have to be like super good at the lifts and really bad at squats for that to make sense, which there are people like that for sure. The benefit I could see of doing squats first, say in like a double day session where you did squats before, in your early AM session and you did the lifts at PM, is that you potentially would feel better going into the
Right.
PM session, right? Versus like, starting doing all of it in one, or starting with the lifts first and squats second. But again, like, I don't think it would make or break anything. The negative impacts it have on the lifts would have to be outweighed by the benefits you get from doing it first. But again, it's like, we can also go back and look and say, okay, like, it's a possibility that you could squat, in this situation. I remember how many times there's squats in this program, maybe 3. You've got 3 squat sessions here. He's got 4 times a week. This person could have 8 squat sessions in this week. And instead of, maybe 3 of them are overload sessions, are hard enough to drive results, and the other 3 are maintenance sessions that are very low volume, right? You could have, primer kind of squatting movements done first, if that helps somebody feel their legs better and improves their technique.
Right.
So you could increase the number of sessions, right? They could have, session 6, 7, 8 here, or 5, 6, 7. And those last 3 could be maintenance sessions with, work capacity loads or general strength loads that are really low volume, 8 reps done as, whatever, 4 doubles at 75% in your squat, where it's like, it's not significant enough to drive results, but it's enough to prime you, and it's enough to give you some kind of maintenance and technique practice. Does it make sense?
Yeah,
so that would be
does.
A benefit I could see there. I could also see it being a benefit, like, one thing that is potentially beneficial for people who are weak in the jerk, is what we've got here, is to have squats before jerks, right? Because it potentially fatigues their legs a little bit, so they're more used to doing jerks with slightly, where it feels slightly harder, right? So again, like, those are examples.
I've never seen jerks that far down in a training day.
Right. This was actually just written in there earlier.
Okay.
but I have done that. I've had
Okay.
people do jerks after squats. Yeah, it's not like just random in there, but I put it in there as an example to show an overhead exercise could go here. This could be like overhead squat or push press or something, right, where it's done at the end.
Have you seen anyone do jerks from the blocks or from the rack before clean and jerks to get like more dedicated practice to the jerk before they went on to something that like would slightly fatigue the jerk?
I haven't really seen that. I'm trying to think if I've ever had anyone do like jerks first. Generally not, which doesn't mean it's wrong. The reality is, like, that's a great like question to say. If you think about it, right, the jerk is probably it might be the fastest of the 3 lifts.
Right.
It doesn't require as much power as the other 2, but the jerk could potentially be something that's very potentiating to a snatch or a clean, right? And so, yeah, I mean, there might be benefit to doing jerks first in a session, especially if you're going to do like clean and jerk second.
Right.
You might do like jerks working up heavier, because you can lift a little bit more and do like a maintenance, like, up to 90% single in the jerk, and then have a full overload session of clean and jerk, where suddenly the jerk feels easy because you've already gone up above that number, right? But you don't have to do that with the clean as well. So that's actually an interesting idea. I had never thought of that.
Well, because I have someone who, she'll do like doubles off the blocks at a weight, make it look relatively good, snappy, split power jerk, and then when she goes to do like a clean jerk or clean jerk, it seems like the jerk deteriorates faster and is lower quality. And she was wondering, like, well, it feels so good from the blocks that maybe if I did that working up, I could prime kind of the same feeling and then try and find that when I do the clean and jerks.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's actually an interesting idea, right? Because that kind of goes to the exercise selection process, right? Is to say, what exercises, like what filters do we put on this person that this person has to go through to get to an exercise? And, as coaches, we have the ability to have a filter that's, a statement, and just be like, oh, this person does better with this. But to quantify, that's a little bit more difficult. But it is kind of interesting to say, like, people who are potentially bad at the jerk, from the clean, but exceptionally good at the jerk from the blocks, or let's say they're way better at jerk from behind the neck than in front, the potentiating effect of doing that beforehand, you could accomplish that a couple ways. One, you could have a complex. So you could do, I mean, as ridiculous as it is, like a complex of like doing a jerk from the blocks and then doing a clean and jerk from the floor, as a cluster, right? Which sounds totally weird, but like, potentially has a beneficial effect. You have to, your complex would look like jerk plus clean plus jerk. Right. But it might have the effect of like, oh, hey, that first jerk they did was that potentiating that when they did the clean and jerk second, it was beneficial. I don't know how much that potentiating effect would occur after you do a clean, but I've seen people do like a clean and then put the bar on blocks, or they do like a clean and a jerk, then drop the bar onto blocks and do a second jerk from the blocks. There's also a lot of other weird complexes. I think we're talking about this, like, Vardanian, New York would do a lot of stuff. You'd see people like putting weights on the bar in the middle of this. So I spoke to a Russian coach well over like 10, 12 years ago. And he was living in maybe Norway at the time or Finland at the time, but he had sent some really cool information, and he talked about that kind of complex, like where they would do like a pull with 110% of their max and then strip off, 40 kilos and then do a snatch, or same with a clean, or do a clean and then strip off the weight and do, 3 jerks, or, do a power clean, then add weight and do 2 jerks or something. So those kind of interesting complexes can certainly be used, right? And that's actually something I think is very exciting, because it's like, those are just different ways of organizing the training to get a better effect for the session itself. So yeah.
And that would lead me to another question about skill acquisition or transfer. So I again, coming back to another lifter, when they do like a no contact snatch, right? The bar stays super close, they get super vertical, they pull the bar and place it in a better spot overhead. And then it's almost like with the full snatch with contact, the bar tends to sit more forward. And I've been thinking, it's like, okay, so they can do it, they can execute it perfectly with almost the same load. And then when they do the classic, it is just slightly out of position. Do you have a gauge by which you try to track that, like, change over time, when it's enough, when it's not enough? So my thought would be, if they can execute it correctly with a variation, eventually it'll transfer to the full lift at some point. So there's no like special consideration there. Do you have a way of kind of like tinkering with that, or just letting it play out? Or
yeah, I would say that, so it's kind of a question of exposure, right? How much exposure of this exercise before we make a judgment as to whether or not it's transferring.
Right.
And there's a possibility that like there could be missing links there, that like there's transfer if the exercise is done in a vacuum, right? Like a power snatch. If you just did power snatches and you put 20 kilos in your power snatch, probably your full snatch is going to go up. Like there's probably very little necessary to do, because the correlation is like almost 1, right? It's almost the same. But something like, a no contact snatch, the correlation might be kind of weak, or it might be stronger for some, weaker for others. And so in and of itself, doing no contact snatches in total isolation might not improve your classic snatch that much. But if it's done, in conjunction with, at the same time, it might have a significant transfer of training, right? So it's like, that's something to sort of think about with what you're doing when you're having exposure to an exercise. If you have exposure to it and it's got a high enough transfer, then it probably doesn't matter how it's organized, as long as it's being done. If it doesn't have that same level of correlation, it might have a significant impact on the transfer of that exercise if it's done in conjunction with the classic exercise, right? So like, a no contact snatch might be very beneficial if it's done as the warm up for every snatch session you do, right? Where it's not that the transfer is like a strength quality that's being developed, but the skill acquisition of doing it first really greatly improves the classic snatch.
Yeah.
right? And you get more of that skill change, you get more of that technique change because the exposure is so much more constant, and it's also so much more immediate,
So
right?
how
Something. Oh,
would you organize that? So say that, because it literally, when they do the no contact snatch, it's Nork Vardanian-esque, it's
right.
perfect. And then the classic snatch, the hips start to move slightly beyond the knees, the bar tends to sit just a little out front. So is it, okay, warm up, no contact to a certain percentage, drop down, introduce contact, or is it 1+1, kind of that same idea of the jerk plus clean jerk?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to know, right? I would say, like, I would look at exactly what's going on, right? Sounds like the person's throwing their hips forward too much on the classic snatch. And so it's like, it could be that the no contact in combination with the classic snatch is one thing, but there could be like a missing piece of, like, maybe somewhere in between those, you have like a hang snatch from above the knee with no feet or something.
Right.
That really, like, is a secondary eliminating, like a secondary thing that's in there. So you might have like, no contact snatch, and then your hang snatch plus classic snatch, both with no feet. Right. So it's like you might be titrating in
Right.
classic snatches as you go, to the point that, like, you're really just changing their technique fundamentally to get them to eliminate that. The other thing to remember with this stuff is, like, that sounds like a really cool idea, and it could be just a fucking failure.
Right.
But it's like, it sounds like a cool idea. It's also important to remember the application, who's doing it.
Right.
So we, in the AI system, I use the qualification system, right? We have our own numbers associated with it. But it's important to remember different types of athletes don't need to be exposed to certain things, right? Like, so like beginners shouldn't be exposed to a lot of like slow eccentric or pausing or tempo changing exercises, because they just don't have the fundamental learning, right, to benefit from it. It could actually, mess them up, right? If you have somebody pause at the knee for 6 months when they first learn, like, they might have some weird hiccup there. So it's like, okay, if the skill level of the athlete dictates that, hey, this person probably would benefit from it, then I would say, try finding a way to get that same technical element to become more obvious to them throughout the lift.
Right.
So you could try a couple things, right? You could try, like, one no contact snatch plus one classic snatch as like a cluster, which is probably less advisable because the technique of them is different enough that it might throw them off a lot.
Right.
But it might not. I mean, it can't hurt to try. It's not your lifting career.
Right.
But so, like, yeah, something like that, or constructing a complex that might make sense, like you warm up with no contact snatches, and then you work to, like, a no foot snatch, or a hang snatch with no feet plus a classic snatch with no feet. And like, try those things where you kind of figure out a way to organize it, and then, like, put it in the program in a way that you can manage and isolate and say, is this really helping? Right. Like, get a baseline as to where their technique is at, maybe get, a video of them with 90% now, and then, say, okay, for the next 2 training blocks, we're going to work with these 3 exercises in different variations, and see what happens. And if there's a significant change after, 4 or 5 weeks or 6 weeks or something, then you could say, okay, there's definitely some benefit to these complexes. Let's strip away things we think didn't help.
Right.
What if you just got rid of the no contact snatch, right? Or what if you just got rid of the whatever cluster set of doing 1 and 1, and see what happens, right? If there's a regression, then for sure that exercise helped.
Right.
But if there's also no change, then you might look at, like, okay, none of these things worked. Like, if there was no change from baseline, none of these things worked, then it's just like they just do no contact snatches better than they do classic snatches.
Yeah.
You need to find a way to teach them to do snatches better, right?
Right. So I guess, like, ultimately the question is coming down to kind of that, at least for me, like, that lag of training, the lag of training effects. So, or the lag there is with training to see an effect. So you introduce a no contact snatch, and it's like, okay, the technique is better, they're able to do more weights with that exercise, and then it's just waiting until that, like, ticks over. It's kind of like the same idea with, I guess, when people improve their squat numbers or some strength exercise, like doesn't tend to show itself immediately. There's kind of like the slight delay. And I don't know if you've seen that in your experience or if that's kind of something that's um just what I would think. But have you noticed there's like a longer delay with technique, or like a longer delay with, like, if someone improves their ability to produce force, it generally takes this long to transfer to the classic lift? There's a lot of special considerations there, but
Yeah, so I would say that the key to refining that process is to have the most stable training environment you can,
right,
as
right,
in the
yep,
program. So if you know that the things you track, if the average weight of the barbell and the
mhm,
volume they're doing,
right,
sessions, frequency, if those things are relatively stable, and the easiest way to do it is just do, write the program and then change the exercises and do the exact same program again,
oh, interesting, yeah,
right? Well, because you'd give you the most stable outcome, right?
mhm,
You would get an idea as to like, okay, if the program is very stable and consistent and we add these variables in and it changes dramatically, the result changes, their technique gets better, you know, then we could say we know how fast it takes time to have this transfer.
right,
The thing that's hard to know is that there's other factors too, right? Somebody can become worse at the classic lift because of the way you're training it, right? So you could eat up
right,
training volume from the classic snatch in exchange for a special exercise, and ultimately lose some of the benefits that that training was doing for the classic snatch. If
right,
your whole session, if your whole first block or two of training has no classic snatches in it, and you do a bunch of special exercises and then you start snatching again and you're like, I'm shitty at snatching. Well, you didn't do any
yeah,
snatching, right?
right,
And so it's like, even as much as you do these exercises, they only have so much impact if your skill in the snatch isn't constant, right? Obviously, as somebody gets more solidified, you see those impacts more, right? But it's again like one of those things where it's like, if you have stability, you can start to measure things and start to get
right,
identify like what's, is this really helping or not? So yeah, I mean, I would say the first thing is with that in that situation is like establish the program being consistent first, make sure it's stable,
right,
and then inject a couple of variables you want to monitor and see what happens, and
mhm,
then look for the effect you want, right? If you keep trying things and find the effect that makes a beneficial change, stay with that, right? And then ditch the stuff that's not having an effect. Because
have you
again, the other thing is like the faster you see results from something, the better off you could be.
right,
So if you're trying something, you're like, I
right,
need to give this 6 months to work,
yeah,
like, and if you tried 3 or 4 things and keep trying and trying and trying, you find something that hits, it might be worthwhile to stay with that.
gotcha. Is that something too where you might get specific transfer to like a percentage range? For example, maybe someone improves their technique or ability with 70 to 80%, and then there's a sudden drop off. And then the next block, you try to specialize more towards higher percentages, and there's still that same like very obvious drop off when you increase the weight on the bar. Is that something that's in line too? Is like you can increase your ability to perform a lift, perform it at a certain intensity, perform it with a certain amount of volume. Like there are all these different things you can kind of overlay to create what you've specialized in that can be a 1RM at 101%, or can be like 10 singles at 80%.
Yeah, for sure. Because you have to imagine that as you do training that is in a certain intensity range, it probably transfers most to that intensity range,
Right,
right?
right,
Um, Not to say that it won't transfer up the chain higher intensities, but it's like most often that
gotcha,
exercise is going to have a transfer to ranges that are similar to that.
right,
Um, like think about an example like a power snatch, right? Um, a power snatch will probably have transference all the way to 100%. If your power snatch goes up, your snatch is probably going to increase.
right,
Um, and we're talking like a significant amount, right? If you had a 2 kilos to your power snatch, you're probably not going to notice it. But if your power snatch goes up, you became stronger for sure. Um, and so that's one reason too why like exercise selection is so important, because you can't use exercises that are insufficiently capable of replicating the intensity ranges that you use in
right,
training,
right,
right? That's why like, you know, um, like I mean, no contact snatches, you could possibly do really high weights with those. I mean, depending on who you are, if you're Noric, you could do, 170 and your best snatch is 172. Right. But like, for a lot of people, it's probably gonna be much lower. No hook,
Right.
no hook snatch is probably close to your power snatch, right? Or
Interesting.
probably on the low end of your power snatch. And if you have weak hands, it might be even lower than that.
Right.
So it's like the kind of situation where you would look at like, hey, this exercise, the likelihood of this transferring to my best snatch is going to have to go through that filter.
Gotcha.
A muscle snatch is the best example of this. No one has ever muscle snatched their way to a world record snatch, right? Lasha can do giant muscle snatches because he snatches 225.
Right.
He can muscle snatch 165 as a symptom of the fact that he can snatch 225.
Right.
And so it's like, there's a beneficial transference to do muscle snatches, right? He gets something from it. It might be very minor. It might feel good. It gives him a better sense of the feel for the finish and whatever it is. But like, it's not like an effect that's like anatomical. It's not like it's building him some gigantic amount of like back strength or leg strength or power to produce in the snatch. So yeah, I would say like that's another thing. It's like might be the variations that have the biggest effect on your lifter also have the biggest effect in sort of a limited range. It's like they call it like a what is it, like a false dawn or like a local maximum, where it's like it seems like it's going to work really well and then it just doesn't. There's like a limit to it, right? Squatting is probably the best example of that.
Right.
Driving, you get huge gains in your squat right away and your lifts go way up as a result, and then it just doesn't do anymore. Adding more to your squat just does not help your lifts anymore. And so any further pursuit of it just, it just yields nothing, right? You kind of have the limit of what that is. To a point, obviously. If you're squatting comparable weights to your lifts, then increase still have a benefit.
Right.
But I would say like in that example with that kind of lifter, like one thing to first consider is like, is the execution of our training focused? Are we covering all of the ranges of technique of intensity that we should to develop the qualities we can with the classic snatch?
Right.
If they struggle in certain intensity ranges to keep good technique, potentially it's an issue of there's not enough exposure to those intensities to do them right. So if we just don't touch 90% lifts often enough, we lose a feel for how to do them. And so our psychology takes over and we resort to something that feels right that's wrong. And then, aside from that, it could be that like, okay, we just need to pick exercises that have a transference because they're a little bit heavier. Right. No feet lifts are great because they basically can be done near maximum intensities. Things like pauses and those kind of things. But again, like they have limited transference and like changing a certain aspect, right? You can only get so much out of some things.
Yeah. That was great. I think that was awesome, and it rounded out the video really well.
Cool.
Kind of assimilating more practical aspects to, again, kind of not more of the theory, I guess. I mean, so far everything you've been doing is everywhere. People know about the AI. People know about your coaching, Max's Gym, Max Aita on Instagram. But if they want
my house
to,
now too.
exactly. Now they've seen your house. But if people want to sign up, know more, get some coaching, where can we direct them?
Yeah, just go to weightlifting.ai.
Yeah, it's very simple. Yeah. And I don't quite have that power to drive people to one place, so I'll say on Instagram, Josh_Phil WL, that's PHILWL, Philosophical Weightlifting everywhere else, and we will catch you guys on the next episode or the next video on the YouTube channel.